The sky above Kessler's Reach burned not with the dawn, but with the exhaust of 1,000 alien drop pods. For 3 weeks, 30 million souls waited for death, cut off from the galaxy, believing they were entirely forgotten. And then, the frozen void began to scream. The air inside Bunker Command tasted of ozone, stale sweat, and pulverized concrete. Commander Atticus Graham stared at the tactical holotable, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from 72 hours of uninterrupted wakefulness. The glowing red icons of the Drekkan Ascendancy completely encircled the blue perimeter of the planetary capital, New Anchorage. The red was a creeping tide, slowly, methodically drowning the last bastions of human resistance. "Report on Sector 4, Atticus rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. He leaned his heavy frame against the edge of the console, his tactical vest scorched and missing several ceramic plates. "Shield generators in Sector 4 are at 9%. "Commander," responded Lieutenant James Gregory, his hands flying across a cracked datapad. "The Drekkan bombardment hasn't let up since 0400. They're using plasma mortars. Our kinetic barriers weren't designed to absorb this kind of sustained thermal kinetic energy. If they push with armor, the sector will fall within the hour." Atticus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the crushing weight of despair. New Anchorage was supposed to be a secure agricultural and mining hub, a jewel in the Outer Rim territories. It was heavily defended for a civilian colony, but it was never meant to withstand the concentrated fury of a Drekkan fleet. The aliens were a species of relentless conquerors, biomechanical nightmares that viewed humanity not as a rival, but as an infestation. They had offered no terms, transmitted no demands. They simply arrived, destroyed the orbital defense platforms in a single devastating volley, and began the slaughter. "Pull the 104th Infantry back to the secondary line at Wood Street," Atticus ordered, tracing a finger along the holographic city grid. "Set demolition charges on the residential high-rises along the avenue. If the Drekkan armor rolls through, drop the buildings on them. We need to buy time." "Time for what, Atticus?" The voice belonged to Dr. Sadie Jenkins, the colony's chief engineer and head of communications. She emerged from the shadows of the server corridor, her hands covered in black grease, and her usually neat blonde hair tied back in a chaotic knot. She carried a burnt circuit board, dropping it onto the table with a clatter. "I need time to fix the FTL comms, Sadie," Atticus said, looking up at her. "Tell me you have good news." Sadie shook her head grimly. "That board is from the primary subspace transceiver. It's fried, and not from a power surge or Drekkan orbital fire. It was overloaded manually from a terminal inside the administration district." "Atticus, we aren't just dealing with an alien siege. Someone deliberately silenced this colony right before the Drekkan dropped out of warp." The command center grew dead quiet. The distant, rhythmic thud of artillery above them seemed to amplify in the silence. Atticus stood up straight, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. "Are you absolutely certain? A saboteur?" "I've spent the last 3 days crawling through the maintenance shafts of the primary relay," Sadie said, wiping a streak of grease from her forehead. "The safety protocols were bypassed using executive-level clearance. The cooling systems were shut down, and a raw feedback loop was initiated. It melted the quantum entanglement core into slag. No one outside this system knows we are under attack. The wider Terran Alliance thinks we are just experiencing a standard solar interference blackout." Atticus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. 30 million civilians, 200,000 militia, all trapped in a cage with no way to call for help. "Can you build a secondary beacon?" Atticus asked, his tone shifting from exhaustion to a cold, hard focus. "Not with subspace tech," Sadie replied. "But there is the old tachyon pulse array in the abandoned observatory on Mount Hale. It was decommissioned 50 years ago when the colony upgraded to quantum comms. It's slow, it's archaic, and it will only broadcast an unencrypted distress loop in all directions. But if I can get up there, I might be able to rig it to the city's auxiliary fusion reactor and scream loudly enough into the void that someone, somewhere, hears it." "Mount Hale is outside the primary kinetic shield," Lieutenant Gregory interjected nervously. "It's practically in no man's land." "Then we escort her," Atticus said firmly. "Gregory, take command of the bunker. Sadie, gather your tools. I'm taking Alpha Squad. We're going mountain climbing." As they prepared to leave, Atticus walked through the makeshift triage center in the adjacent cavern. The groans of the wounded, the smell of antiseptic mixed with burnt flesh, and the rows of cots stretching into the dim light were a brutal reminder of the stakes. He stopped by a young soldier, barely 18, whose legs were wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. Private Thomas Reed. "Hold the line, son," Atticus said softly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are they coming, Commander?" the boy whispered, his eyes wide and feverish. "Is the Navy coming?" "We're making the call right now, Thomas," Atticus lied smoothly, masking his own terror. "You just rest." He turned away, his jaw set. He didn't know if anyone was out there. He didn't know if the Terran Navy even had ships in this sector. But he knew humanity's greatest strength was its refusal to die quietly. If Kessler's Reach was going to fall, they would make sure the whole damn galaxy heard their final roar. The armored transport ground its gears as it clawed its way up the treacherous, winding roads of Mount Hale. The sky above was a chaotic tapestry of anti-aircraft tracer fire and the sickly green plasma bolts of Drekken gunships. The air was thin and freezing, but inside the cramped troop compartment, the tension was suffocating. Atticus sat opposite Sadie, his kinetic rifle resting across his knees. Flanking them were 4 of his most seasoned militia veterans. Outside, the world was a war zone. The distant city of New Anchorage glowed like a dying ember beneath a dome of shimmering, failing blue energy. "We're a mile out from the observatory," the driver yelled over the roar of the engine. "Sensors are picking up localized jamming, Commander, and heat signatures, human heat signatures." Atticus frowned. Drekken don't use localized jamming, and they certainly don't read as human. "The saboteur," Sadie breathed, clutching her diagnostic rig tightly to her chest. Whoever destroyed the primary comms must have known about the tachyon array as a backup. "Lock and load," Atticus commanded. The chorus of charging weapons filled the cabin. The transport skidded to a halt outside the heavy ferrocrete blast doors of the old observatory. It was an ancient, brutalist structure built during the early days of planetary colonization. Before Atticus could order his men out, the blast doors hissed open. Standing in the entrance, flanked by a dozen heavily armed private security contractors, was Richard Hayes, the regional director of the Ethereum Extraction Company. Hayes was a man who looked entirely out of place in a war zone. His tailored suit was immaculate, completely at odds with the dirt and blood covering Atticus's men. He held a sleek, silenced pistol at his side. "Commander Graham," Hayes called out, his voice unnervingly calm, amplified by a small megaphone. "I must ask you to turn your vehicle around and return to the city." Atticus kicked the transport doors open and stepped out into the freezing wind, his rifle leveled at Hayes' chest. His squad fanned out behind him, weapons trained on the corporate mercenaries. "Stand down, Hayes," Atticus barked. "I don't have time for corporate games. The Drekken are slaughtering millions of people down there. And Doctor, Jenkins needs to use this facility to call for fleet support." "I am aware of the casualties, Atticus," Hayes said smoothly, taking a step forward. "And I cannot allow Dr. Jenkins to send that signal. The Ethereum Extraction Company has made a difficult but necessary logistical decision." Sadie stepped out behind Atticus, her eyes wide with horrified realization. "You sold us out. You made a deal with them. The Drekken require the ultra-dense Ethereum ore found deep within Kessler's Reach to fuel their war machine," Hayes explained, treating the genocide of 30 million people as a mere boardroom presentation. They were going to take it anyway. By providing them with the orbital defense codes and disabling the FTL communications, the corporation secured a non-aggression pact for our core assets. The civilian population is collateral. A tragic loss, but one that ensures the survival of our executive infrastructure and our off-world supply chains. Atticus felt a blinding rage surge through him. The sheer sociopathic calculus of it made his blood run cold. "You gave them the defense codes? You murdered 30 million people for a mining contract?" "I secured the future of human industry," Hayes corrected coldly. "If you call the Terran Navy, this sector becomes a war zone. The Drekken will glass the planet entirely, destroying the mines. I cannot allow that. Kill them." The order was given casually, but Atticus had spent his life in the mud while Hayes sat in a tower. Before the corporate mercenaries could raise their weapons, Atticus fired. A 3-round burst shattered the chest plate of the merc nearest to Hayes. Alpha Squad opened fire in perfect synchronization. The firefight was brutal and short. The mercenaries were well equipped, but they were bullies used to intimidating striking miners, not hardened soldiers fighting for their home. Kinetic rounds tore through the freezing air, shattering the ice in Ferrocrete. Atticus dove behind a concrete pylon, returning fire, methodically picking off the corporate guards. "Sadie! Get inside!" Atticus roared over the deafening crack of gunfire. Sadie didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the icy steps, dodging stray bullets, and slammed her hand against the manual override for the observatory doors. Two mercenaries turned their weapons toward her, but Atticus stepped out of cover, absorbing a grazing shot to his shoulder, and dropped them both with precise headshots. Within 90 seconds, the courtyard was quiet, save for the moans of the dying and the howling wind. Hayes lay on the ground, clutching a shattered knee, his immaculate suit ruined by his own blood. Atticus walked over to him, his boots crunching on the bloody snow. He looked down at the executive with a disgust so profound it bordered on nausea. He kicked Hayes' weapon away. "Secure him," Atticus ordered two of his men. "If he bleeds out, fine. If he doesn't, he hangs when this is over." Atticus followed Sadie into the dark, freezing interior of the observatory. The massive, parabolic dish above them groaned in the wind. Inside the control room, dust covered the archaic consoles. Sadie was already frantically tearing panels off the main console, plugging her modern diagnostic rig into the 50-year-old ports. "The power grid is dead," Sadie said, her fingers moving in a blur. "I have to hotwire the transmitter directly to the transport's fusion cell. Atticus, I need your men to run the heavy cables, from the vehicle to the primary capacitor." For the next 20 agonizing minutes, they worked like demons. Atticus and his squad hauled thick, heavy power cables through the snow, connecting the military transport's engine directly to the observatory's ancient heart. Down in the valley, the blue dome of New Anchorage's shield flickered violently. A massive Drekken dreadnought had descended from orbit, its obsidian hull bristling with plasma cannons. It was preparing to deliver the killing blow to the city's defenses. "Power is green," Sadie yelled from the control room. "Capacitors are charging. The tachyon array is spooling up. It's going to take everything the transport has to push the signal through the Drekken atmospheric jamming." "Do it," Atticus said, standing behind her, watching the progress bar on her screen. "What's the message?" "Standard SOS," Sadie said, her voice shaking slightly. "Coordinates, planetary distress code, and a simple text loop. New Anchorage under siege by Drekken Ascendancy. Defenses failing. Require immediate heavy fleet support. God save us. Send it." Sadie slammed her palm onto the execution key. Outside, the massive dish hummed with terrifying power. A blinding, invisible pulse of tachyon energy ripped upward, shattering the storm clouds and piercing the Drekken jamming field. It was a raw, unfiltered scream into the void. A second later, the transport's fusion cell overloaded, exploding in a shower of sparks and flame. The observatory's consoles went dead. "It's sent," Sadie whispered in the dark. "It's out there." Atticus looked out the shattered window toward the city. The blue shield below finally collapsed with a sound like shattering glass that echoed across the mountains. The Drekken ground forces poured into the city streets. "Now," Atticus said grimly, "we wait to see if anyone is listening." 5 hours had passed since the tachyon pulse was fired into the dark. 5 hours of systematic slaughter. Atticus and his surviving squad had made it back to Bunker Command via a hidden maintenance tram, bringing the captive Hayes with them. The command center was in chaos. The Drekken had breached the outer city limits. Street-to-street fighting was turning New Anchorage into a slaughterhouse. "Sector 7 is gone. Sector 8 is overrun," Lieutenant Gregory reported, his voice devoid of emotion, operating purely on shock. "They are purging the residential blocks. We are out of anti-armor munitions. Militia casualties are at 70%. Atticus stared at the tactical map. The red tide had swallowed the city. Only the Central Administration District, where Bunker Command was located beneath a mile of solid rock, remained blue. And the Drekken were closing in. "Seal the blast doors," Atticus ordered softly. "Reroute all remaining power to the bunker's structural integrity fields. Hand out the sidearms to the non-combatants." Sadie sat slumped in a corner, her face buried in her hands. The signal had been sent, but the galaxy was vast. Even if a Terran Alliance listening post picked it up, fleet deployment protocols took days. Days they did not have. The Drekken dreadnought hovered directly over the city center, a monolith of black metal and malice. It was aligning its primary axial weapon, preparing to drill through the rock and vaporize the bunker entirely. High above the planet, on the bridge of the Drekon flagship Voidstalker, Fleetmaster Vroxa watched the extermination with cold, multi-ocular detachment. His species communicated in clicks and subharmonic rumbles. "The prey is contained," his tactical officer chittered. "The shielding is breached, preparing the core borer to eliminate their final subterranean command structure." "Proceed," Vroxa commanded, his mandibles twitching with anticipation. "Leave none alive. This world belongs to the Ascendancy now." Back in the bunker, the ground began to shake violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. The Drekkan were starting to dig. "Commander!" Lieutenant Gregory suddenly shouted, his voice cracking. He practically slammed his hands onto the sensor console. "Commander! I'm getting anomalous readings! Deep space telemetry!" Atticus spun around. "A Drekkan reinforcement fleet?" "No," Gregory said, his eyes glued to the screen, his face bathed in the green glow. "It's not Drekkan. It's not using standard warp geometry. The gravitational readings are completely off the charts. Something is tearing a hole in spacetime." On the tactical holotable, just outside the planet's gravity well, a massive spatial distortion appeared. It wasn't the elegant, mathematically perfect warp bubble used by the Drekkan or the Galactic Council species. It was violent. It was chaotic. In orbit, Fleetmaster Vrox's sensors screamed a warning. A massive spike of Cherenkov radiation washed over the Drekkan fleet, temporarily blinding their optical sensors. Space itself seemed to bruise, turning a violent shade of violet before ripping open with a silent, catastrophic shockwave that violently rattled the shields of every Drekkan ship. They didn't arrive gracefully. They fell out of the dimensional tear like a hammer falling on an anvil. 30 human warships materialized in high orbit. They were not sleek, they had no aesthetic grace. They were brutalist, utilitarian wedges of gray, scarred armor plate, bristling with thrusters and weapon emplacements. At their center was a vessel of monstrous proportions, a super dreadnought easily twice the mass of Vrox's flagship. Painted on its armored prow in stark white lettering was its designation UNS Saratoga. "Identify them!" Vroxa clicked furiously, grasping his command harness as his ship was buffeted by the gravimetric wake of the human arrival. "Unknown configuration. They bear the markings of the prey species below." Before Vroxa could order the fleet to realign its weapons, the human ships moved. They didn't assume standard tactical formations. They didn't power up energy weapons to engage in long-range duels. They ignited their massive fusion drives, lighting up the void like newly birthed stars, and drove straight into the heart of the Drekkan fleet at terrifying speeds. Aboard the Saratoga, Captain Devin Wood stood on the bridge, his uniform immaculate, his expression carved from stone. He was a veteran of the Rim Wars, a man who understood that when dealing with exterminators, you did not offer quarter. "Helm, put us right down their throats," Captain Wood ordered, his voice echoing in the vast, silent bridge. "Gunnery, I want firing solutions on all hostile capital ships. Load the kinetic impactors. Depleted uranium slugs. Give them raw mass." "Firing solutions locked, Captain," the gunnery officer reported. "Open a wideband transmission on all frequencies," Wood said, stepping up to the command display. "Let's introduce ourselves." In the bunker beneath New Anchorage, the shaking stopped. The static on the emergency radio suddenly cleared, replaced by a deep, authoritative human voice that echoed through the caverns, broadcast simultaneously across the entire planet and the Drekkan fleet above. "Attention alien vessels. This is Captain Devin Wood of the Terran Alliance Super Dreadnought Saratoga, commanding the 7th Heavy Assault Fleet. You are trespassing in sovereign Terran space. You are currently engaging in the unprovoked slaughter of our citizens." There was a brief pause, filled only with the hum of the radio. "We don't negotiate with exterminators. May God have mercy on your souls, because the Terran Navy will not. All batteries open fire." The sky above Kessler's Reach erupted. The human ships didn't use plasma or lasers. They used electromagnetic railguns the size of skyscrapers. Massive slugs of dense, depleted uranium were accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. When they struck the Drekkan ships, they didn't just drain the kinetic shields, they shattered them through sheer, overwhelming brute force. A volley from the Saratoga struck a Drekkan cruiser in low orbit. The impact was entirely kinetic. The alien ship was simply punched through, its armor caving in as the massive slugs tore through its biomechanical heart, detonating its core. The cruiser violently snapped in half, raining burning debris into the upper atmosphere like a meteor shower. In the bunker, the holotable showed the red icons in orbit, rapidly blinking out of existence, replaced by the heavy, solid blue markers of the Terran Navy. Atticus collapsed into a chair, letting out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 weeks. Beside him, Sadie was openly weeping, clutching the edge of the console. Even Lieutenant Gregory was laughing, a hysterical sound of pure relief. "They came," Private Thomas Reed whispered from his cot in the medical bay, listening to the broadcast over the PA system. "They actually came." Up in orbit, Fleet Master Vraxa watched in absolute horror as his invincible armada was torn to pieces. The humans were fighting with a ferocity and a disregard for standard naval tactics that bordered on madness. A human destroyer, engines blazing, rammed directly into a Drekken frigate, crushing it beneath a prow of reinforced titanium, before firing point-blank nuclear torpedoes into the surrounding swarm. "Evasive maneuvers!" Vraxa shrieked, watching his tactical display dissolve into chaos. "Charge the main battery! Target the human flagship!" But Captain Wood was already 2 steps ahead. "Helm, bring us alongside their command ship. Gunnery, prepare for broadside. Let's show them what a Terran greeting looks like." The Saratoga slid through the void, ignoring the glancing plasma fire of the surviving Drekken ships, and pulled up alongside the Void Stalker. The massive armored panels along the human dreadnought's flank retracted, revealing rows of heavy missile tubes and secondary rail batteries. The void of space, cold and silent for billions of years, now belonged entirely to the howling wrath of humanity. The sky above New Anchorage did not just clear, it tore open. While the upper atmosphere cascaded with the burning, incandescent wreckage of the Drekken fleet, the war on the ground had reached a fever pitch. The arrival of the Terran Alliance's 7th Heavy Assault Fleet had shattered the aliens' orbital supremacy, but 20,000 Drekken shock troops were still entrenched within the city limits, and they had no intention of dying alone. Inside Bunker Command, the tactical holotable flickered back to life, fed by data streams directly from the UNS Saratoga. "Commander Graham!" Lieutenant Gregory shouted over the din of cheering staff. "Orbital drop pods detected! Terran Marine Vanguard is deploying directly into the Central Plaza. Designation: 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, the Hellhounds." Atticus didn't celebrate. His tactical mind, honed by years of border skirmishes, saw the immediate danger. The Drekken ground forces aren't retreating, Gregory. Look at their vectors. They're consolidating. Sadie looked up from a terminal, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed the telemetry. They're ignoring the defensive perimeters. Atticus, they're moving toward the primary Ethereum refinery in Sector 9. If they capture the raw processing cores, they can use the volatile, unrefined ore as an improvised planetary explosive. Before Atticus could reply, a harsh, mocking laugh echoed from the holding cell at the back of the command center. Richard Hayes sat against the reinforced glass, a bloody bandage tied around his knee, his face twisted in a sneer. "You think you've won because your precious Navy showed up?" Hayes spat, coughing up a spray of dark blood. "You fools! The Ethereum Extraction Company doesn't leave loose ends." The moment the orbital array went dark, and the primary network failed to report an executive override, a corporate clean slate protocol was initiated. Atticus walked slowly to the glass, his boots leaving bloody prints on the concrete. "Speak clearly, Hayes, or I will let the militia have 5 minutes alone with you." "The refinery's cooling systems are already being systematically shut down by the central mainframe," Hayes whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "It's an automated asset denial system. If the corporation loses the planet, nobody gets it. In exactly 25 minutes, the superdense core will reach critical mass. It will vaporize New Anchorage and crack the tectonic plate. The Drekken aren't trying to harvest the ore. They know they're trapped. They're going there to ensure the explosion happens. Can we override it from here?" Sadie demanded, her hands already flying across her console. "No," Hayes smiled widely. "The override console is inside the refinery's core chamber, and it requires a physical, manual, hard reset. but the Drekon have already established a perimeter around the facility. You'll never get inside. Atticus turned back to the holotable, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. Gregory, patch me through to Captain Wood on the Saratoga. Tell him we need a pinpoint drop on Sector 9 immediately. Sadie, grab your gear. We're going back into the fire. Tactical status report. Sector 9 refinery. Time to core criticality. 21 minutes, 14 seconds. Hostile force strength. Estimated 3,000 Drekon heavy infantry. Friendly force strength. Alpha Squad. 4 Marines. 2nd Battalion Vanguard. Deploying. Objective. Secure core control room. Initiate manual coolant flush. The transit to Sector 9 was a nightmare of violent turbulence. Atticus, Sadie, and the remains of Alpha Squad rode inside a retrofitted heavy civilian cargo hauler, escorted by 2 newly arrived Navy atmospheric gunships. Below them, the streets of New Anchorage were a chaotic mosaic of burning buildings and retreating alien armor. Suddenly, the sky above them lit up with sonic booms. 3 heavy Alliance dropships streaked past, their hulls painted in the matte black and crimson liveries of the Terran Marines. This is Major Raymond Cross, 5th Marines, to Ground Command. A gravelly voice erupted over Atticus's comlink. We copy your distress call, Commander Graham. We are establishing a hot landing zone at the refinery gates. We will clear a path, but our intel says that core is ticking. You have the ball. Copy that, Major Cross, Atticus replied, slamming a fresh thermal clip into his rifle. We are right behind you. Look for the civilian hauler. Don't shoot the locals. The cargo hauler slammed onto the industrial asphalt of the refinery's outer courtyard, the ramp dropping before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and burning chemicals. The scene was pure, unadulterated carnage. Major Cross's Marines had already formed a defensive wall of ceramite shields and heavy repeating railguns, pouring a devastating hail of hypersonic fire into the mass of Drekon infantry defending the refinery entrance. The aliens, towering biomechanical monstrosities clad in chitinous armor, fought with the desperation of cornered beasts. They fired heavy plasma rifles that melted the concrete barriers, but the Marines advanced with mechanical, ruthless precision. Graham! Major Cross shouted over the deafening roar of a heavy autocannon. He was a mountain of a man, his power armor scarred by dozens of campaigns. My boys will hold the door! Take the engineer and get into that basement. You've got less than 15 minutes before this whole valley turns into a second sun. Alpha Squad, form up on Dr. Jenkins, Atticus roared, drawing his sidearm. Move! 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 They sprinted through the shattered glass doors of the primary administrative complex, stepping over the bodies of corporate security guards who had been executed by the Drekon. The floor beneath them hummed with a terrifying, low-frequency vibration. The Ethereum core was singing its death song. The deeper they descended into the subterranean levels of the refinery, the hotter the air became. The walls, lined with massive conduits of liquid nitrogen, were sweating. Red emergency lights bathed the steel corridors in a sinister, rhythmic crimson pulse. The automated locks are engaged, Sadie yelled, her voice echoing down the hall as they reached the primary blast doors of the core chamber. The corporate mainframe has sealed the sector. Blow it, Atticus ordered. 2 militia soldiers slammed breaching charges onto the magnetic locks. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, blowing the heavy doors off their tracks. As the smoke cleared, a volley of emerald plasma fire erupted from the darkness inside. Ambush! Atticus yelled, diving behind a heavy structural pillar. One of his militia soldiers wasn't fast enough. A plasma bolt struck him full in the chest, vaporizing his armor and dropping him instantly. A squad of Drekon elite guards, larger and more heavily armored than the shock troops outside, had dug themselves into the control room. They knew the human plan. They didn't need to win a war. They just needed the timer to hit 0. We don't have time for a firefight, Sadie screamed, checking her datapad. 7 minutes, Atticus. The magnetic containment fields are beginning to fracture. Atticus looked at the remaining 2 militia men, then at Sadie. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, but her eyes were steady. She was an engineer, not a soldier, yet she had marched directly into hell without a second thought. Cover me, Atticus said simply. Atticus, no, There are too many of them. Sadie reached out, but he was already moving. Atticus Graham did not run with the grace of a young recruit. He moved with the momentum of a man who had given everything to this colony and refused to let a corporate contract or an alien empire tear it away. He broke cover, firing his kinetic rifle one-handed, screaming a defiant, primal roar that echoed over the hiss of escaping steam. A plasma bolt grazed his thigh, melting the fabric and scorching his flesh. But he didn't stop. He threw himself over a data console, landing directly on top of a Drekon guard. He buried his combat knife deep into the creature's neck joint, twisting until the biomechanical optics went dark. The remaining two militia soldiers advanced, pouring sustained fire into the secondary Drekon positions, forcing them back toward the cooling vats. "Sadie! Now!" Atticus shouted, pinning a second alien down with his body weight as he struggled to keep its plasma blade away from his throat. Sadie sprinted across the catwalk, ignoring the stray rounds whining past her ears. She slid on her knees beneath a collapsing pipe, coming to a halt in front of the primary override console. The screen was flashing a single catastrophic warning. Core integrity, 2%. To bypass the executive protocol, Sadie muttered to herself, her fingers tearing away the plastic casing of the console to expose the raw circuitry. I don't need a password. I just need to cut the logic gate. She pulled a heavy industrial plasma cutter from her belt and jammed it directly into the central processing unit of the corporate mainframe. The console erupted in a shower of blue sparks. The screen went black for one agonizing second, before rebooting into a manual text interface. Manual override detected. Emergency coolant flush initiated. Above them, massive valves groaned as millions of gallons of liquid nitrogen flooded back into the overheating reactor core. The violent shaking of the facility slowly began to subside, transitioning from a terrifying shudder back to a stable industrial thrum. Behind her, the sound of gunfire ceased. Atticus stood over the body of the last Drekon guard, his uniform torn, his breath ragged, and his shoulder bleeding heavily. He looked at the console, then at Sadie, and allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Good job, Doctor," he croaked, before his legs finally gave out and he collapsed against the console. "Atticus!" Sadie rushed to his side, pulling out a medical field dressing. "I'm fine," he muttered, gripping her hand. "Just tired." "Did we save it?" "We saved it," she whispered, looking up through the reinforced glass at the stable, glowing blue light of the reactor. "The city is still standing." 3 hours later, the surface of Kessler's Reach was quiet, for the first time in nearly a month. The surviving Drekon ground forces had surrendered unconditionally after their fleet was systematically erased from the sector. The planetary capital of New Anchorage was heavily damaged, but its people were alive. In the center of the city plaza, surrounded by the towering, blocky armor of the Terran Marines, Captain Devin Wood stepped down from his personal shuttle. He walked through the crowd of cheering civilians, his eyes scanning the devastation until he found Commander Graham, who was being treated by a naval medic. "Commander," Captain Wood said, extending a gloved hand, "your distress signal was received. I apologize for the delay. The warp transit through the Drekon jamming corridor was less than precise." Atticus shook the captain's hand, using his good arm to pull himself up straight. "You got here, Captain. That's all that matters. If you had been 20 minutes later." "We picked up Director Hayes trying to reach a corporate shuttle in the confusion," Wood interrupted, his voice dropping to a cold, hard tone. "He is currently in the brig of the Saratoga. The Terran Alliance High Court has already issued a warrant for his execution under the High Treason and Planetary Endangerment Acts. The Ethereum Extraction Company's charter has been permanently revoked." Sadie walked up, her hands clean for the first time in weeks, standing beside Atticus. "What happens to the colony now, Captain? We're a long way from the core worlds." Captain Wood looked around at the resilient faces of the militia, the miners, and the families who had survived the dark. He smiled faintly. "The 7th Fleet is establishing a permanent orbital station here," Wood said firmly. "You've proven that Kessler's Reach is worth fighting for. The galaxy thought no aid was coming for you. They forgot that humanity doesn't leave its own behind. Welcome back to the Alliance." Atticus looked up at the sky, where the massive silhouette of the UNS Saratoga hung like a protective shield over the world. The void was no longer empty, and it was no longer silent. If this story of human resilience, corporate betrayal, and the unstoppable might of the Terran Navy stirred your soul, don't let it fade into the void. Smash that like button, share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and subscribe to the channel right now. By hitting that notification bell, you ensure you never miss another epic tale of humanity's defiance against overwhelming odds. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite moment. Stay strong and stand ready.
Hi, my name is Tran Truan, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, they thought no aid was coming. Then Human Warship came howling from the void HFY sci-fi story. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of hope arriving at the very last moment. Stories like this capture the powerful idea that even when everything seems lost, help can still be on the way. The arrival of unexpected allies is one of those moments that makes HFY stories so memorable. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that showing up for others matters, especially when they feel alone or forgotten. In our everyday lives, a simple act of support can have a bigger impact than we realise. What scene stood out to you the most? And if you were in that situation, what would have gone through your mind when those warships finally appeared? Thank you for spending time with Palace Truths. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY stories and sci-fi adventures.